Okay, this is going to be lecture number 9. This lecture is going to deal with the American people, the culture of the American people between 1815 and 1861. I'm going to call this the American Renaissance. At one time, this was called the antebellum period, but I'm changing it to the Renaissance period. I want to start off by having a short discussion about the American South, and then we'll get into some of the specifics here, what's going on during this time period when it comes to the American people and how they are living during this time period. One of the big questions during the antebellum period, during this Renaissance period, is going to be slavery, the issue of slavery. They have kicked this can down the road from 1787 all the way up into the 1860s. And this issue has not been settled yet. One of the main characters here from the American South is a gentleman whose name is James Henry Hammond. James Henry Hammond is from South Carolina. Mr. Hammond is going to take the place of Mr. John C. Calhoun. Mr. Calhoun died in the early 1850s. Well, in 1856, or 1858 rather, on March the 4th, 1858, Mr. Hammond made a speech before Congress, and it is called the King Cotton Speech. And he says that no one dares make war on cotton, that cotton is a powerhouse of America, and cotton is where our economy is strongest. If we lose cotton, we'll lose the American economy. America will go bankrupt, and we'll have major problems in America. Now remember, guys, he makes this speech about 8 years after the Panic of 1837 has ended. So we've already been through a major depression. And here he is making this speech here. There'll be another depression if we go through and we kill cotton in this time period. And he says, "You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." This was called the King Cotton Speech. And the man who gave the speech is James Henry Hammond, and he is from South Carolina. Okay, so Mr. Hammond is part of all this debate over cotton. You know, there's a visitor came to Mobile, Alabama during this time period, and they wrote about Mobile as being a cotton city. They said, everywhere I look in Mobile, I see cotton. I see cotton men who are married to cotton wives. I see cotton children. I see cotton homes and cotton carriages. And everybody here in this area is dealing with cotton. And that's true to a certain extent. Mobile is a very major cotton center during this time period. And Mobile was centered around the production of cotton. They would send the steamboats of the Tombigbee up the Alabama River and pick up cotton at Claiborne and at Butler and on up toward Demopolis and so forth, and Selma. And so cotton was a big import product here for Mobile during this time period. Okay, so king cotton is a key term here during this time period. Cotton is king. Now you have to remember also that cotton was placed on the back of people. People were forced to produce cotton, to grow cotton, to pick cotton, and they got nothing out of it. They did it for free labor. And of course, these are the people who were enslaved during this time period. One of the biggest concerns here in this Renaissance period was slave uprisings. Every Sunday morning at church, somebody had a story to tell about somebody having a slave that got out of hand, or a slave uprising. And it was pretty interesting that slave uprisings were not that prevalent. We had a few major ones around, but most were just local incidents on plantations. But the biggest one of all is going to involve a man whose name is Denmark Vesey. Denmark Vesey was captured in Africa when he was about 7 years old. He was a little boy. He was brought across the Atlantic Ocean to the island of Barbados. And on Barbados, he was sold to an owner of a large sugarcane plantation. After a few weeks in the sugarcane plantation, Denmark Vesey fell out. He got sick, something that happened, it might have been epilepsy. But anyway, that old master deemed that Denmark Vesey was defective, and he wanted his money back, or he wanted to exchange him for another little boy. Well, 6 months later, the old sea captain comes back around, bringing another load of slaves into Haiti, and the old slave owner goes to the docks and meets with this captain. The captain's name is Joseph Vesey. And Joseph Vesey agrees to exchange little Denmark, Go get it now, down. So, guys, what happens here is that Denmark Vesey is going to be given back to the owner of the ship which brought him here to this Barbados territory, this island of Barbados. And of course, the ship's captain gives the old man, the old slave owner, another slave in exchange for Denmark. Well, Joseph Vesey is convinced that Denmark cannot be sold again, that nobody would want a little kid who's defective. So he decided to adopt him. This old ship captain adopts this little boy from Africa. And for the next 20 years, 25 years, these two are just like father and son. Denmark Vesey is going to learn how to read and write. Denmark Vesey is going to learn how to sail the seas. He becomes a well-known navigator of the oceans out here between America and Africa. So Denmark Vesey is going to be a very important person here. All right. In 1800, Joseph Vesey retires from the shipping industry, and Denmark Vesey is going to be freed. So when Mr. Joseph Vesey retires from the shipping industry, Denmark gets its freedom, and Denmark becomes a well-known carpenter here in Charleston, South Carolina. Well, he's going to join a local church, a local AMH church, and at this church, they're going to start discussing the great Moses and how Moses led the children of Israel out of bondage. And these people here in Charleston begin to identify with the children of Israel. They're trying to find their great Moses who will lead them out of slavery. And of course, they turn their attention to Denmark. He's well educated. He knows how to sail the seas. He's a perfect gentleman to do the job as a great Moses here for these people. Well, at the church, they started having lots of prayer meetings and lots of church gatherings and so forth. And these were not religious gatherings. These were training sessions. Denmark is training the people of this church, there's over 100 of them, how to sail ships to Africa. He's going to teach them how to go through and get into the trade winds, how to go through and trim the sails, how to go through and anchor the ships and so forth. So these people come very well versed, or well educated on how to go across the Atlantic Ocean as far as shipping is concerned. Okay? Denmark Vesey is planning a great slave uprising in Charleston to take place on July the 14th, 1822. They've had plenty of time here, guys, training, getting ready for this rendezvous with fate. Okay? On July the 14th, 1822, they're planning to make their daring escape out of Charleston. Well, here's the plan. On the church meeting on the night before, Denmark Vesey and his followers are going to produce some poison. This poison is going to go to every household in Charleston. And in the household, they're going to pour this poison into the old master's breakfast. As the white families are sitting around the table eating their breakfast, they're being poisoned. While the city of Charleston lays dying, these people will make their way to the harbor. There are about 4 or 5 ships normally in the harbor here at Charleston. They're going to overcome the sailors and the ship's captains. They're going to board these ships and sail off toward the island of Haiti. From Haiti, they'll sail to Barbados, and from Barbados, they'll sail back to the coast of Africa. That's their game plan. Well, in the middle of the night, here on July the 14th, in the early morning hours, an old trusted slave told his master the plan. Across town, a young girl told her mistress of the plan. And Charleston goes into total turmoil. These white folks get out torches, they light them, and they start hauling down the streets, gathering up all these various people here that have belonged to this church. They get them all together. They're going to try them. 34 of these men were found in the conspiracy to commit murder here across Charleston, and they were hung, including Denmark Vesey. Some 75 other people that were part of this group will find themselves going to a Caribbean island where they will live out a death sentence. Slaves do not live very long on these islands of the Caribbean. 7 years at the most. Most of them don't live 2 or 3 years because of hard labor and all the heat and so forth down here in this region. So guys, the Denmark Vesey uprising is going to take place here in Charleston, but it does not quite work out for them. Okay, and across the South, people are talking about this Denmark Vesey uprising and what they should do to stop it. Well, the best way to stop it is outlaw slavery. And they had a good chance here because this same time period in 1822, Mexico has already outlawed slavery across their country. England outlawed slavery across the empire in 1831 time period. So the South had a chance here to take care of the situation, but they would not do it. This is also during the time of the Missouri Compromise. And that could easily have been part of the compromise was ending slavery here and solving the problem forever. They would not do it. All they want to do is grow cotton and own their slaves. That's all they cared about here in the South. Remember, I mentioned in the Andrew Jackson lecture, the one before this one, about how we had this abolitionist movement and how William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberator, came out. They're trying to find a way to end slavery through the press, and how Congress is going to pass a gag rule. Congress passed this gag rule over the power of Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats got this through Congress. Andrew Jackson had a hand in it also because he was president during this time period of this gag act. All right. One of the big people here that was trying to stop this gag act is going to be your former president, John Quincy Adams. He fought real hard. Him and Daniel Webster and these northern representatives, they fought really hard trying to stop anything that would stop this abolitionist movement in the American South. They realized if they could get the slaves riled up enough that they could fight against their masters. If the slaves fought against the masters and won the battle, then they won their battle through fighting. And this keeps politics out of the picture completely, because politics has failed us over and over again when it comes to slavery. Okay? So guys, remember all of this about the Gag Act. If you're not real familiar with this, go back to the Jackson lecture. This is lecture number 8 toward the end of it. And you can get all the details here that deals with this item. Also, you can go through and read the lecture notes. So either way, it's good to do so. Well, this all becomes a major church issue across the South. Slavery becomes a major church issue across the South. The one institution that should be totally against slavery is the church. But the churches bought into it. They bought into it because they were getting money from these wealthy plantation owners. And cotton culture was making the churches wealthy here across the South. And they didn't want to upset the apple cart. They wanted to make sure that slavery was always in place here so the church would exist here being funded by slavery. Well, guys, these three churches here, they were formed during the Great Awakening. The three big churches, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Baptists, began to fuss over slavery. They started actually fighting over slavery. One of them says, well, Abraham had slaves, so therefore God ordained it, and it should be no problem with us having slaves. And then one of them says, well, the Roman Empire had slaves, so did the Greeks, and so did the Egyptians. But what happened to them? They fell apart because of slavery. When Rome fell apart in the 4th century, they were 75% slaves. The wealthy class had enslaved the poor class during this time period, and were heading for the middle class. Those Visigoths showed up. The Roman people says, if you can govern better than these fools can, take over. We're tired of them and trying to enslave everybody. So you have an invasion here that's going to totally overthrow the Roman Empire here in this time period. All right, and then the church tries to take over, which does not work out real well either. The Catholic Church is not a powerful group enough to be governing people during this time period. So here you have these three churches that are still dealing with the same old problems here over slavery. They should have been preaching ending of slavery, but instead they started fighting over slavery. Okay, June the 5th, 1837. Now, Andrew Jackson has just left office as president. Martin Van Buren is your president during this time period. On June the 5th, 1837, the Presbyterians meet and they start discussing their convention articles, their convention constitutions, their convention policies here together as one group. And part of the questioning here is going to be over slavery. What do we do about slavery? Well, the Southern Presbyterians wanted to keep slavery intact. The Northern Presbyterians wanted to have slavery end. So what happens here, guys, in 1837, the Presbyterian Church is going to split over slavery. They're going to split over slavery. You'll have your Southern Presbyterians, and then you'll have your Northern Presbyterians, and they will not meet again. Will not meet again until like the 1970s. They rejoin each other. It'll be a long time they rejoin each other. Then the Methodists start in on it. The Methodists that had their problem in 1845. They were in Louisville, Kentucky. It's May of 1845, and they start fussing over slavery. These are your Methodist people. And here they divided over slavery. They divided over slavery. And for over 100 years, the Methodist Church was split because of slavery. They did not rejoin themselves until the late 1930s. When they rejoined themselves, they called themselves the United Methodist Church. They come back together again. And then, of course, in the summer of 1845, the Baptists meet. They meet in Charleston, South Carolina. And in this meeting, the Baptists begin to fuss over slavery. And from this comes the Southern Baptist Church and the Northern Baptist Church. The Southern Baptist Church will send all their delegates and all their offices to Nashville, Tennessee. When I was going to school at Ole Miss, we called Nashville Vatican City because that's where all the Baptists were, up in Nashville, Tennessee. And they split over slavery. Now, why is this important, guys? When these churches, when these fundamental churches fall apart over slavery, the American people have made enemies of each other. I want you to realize this is like 70% of the people are split over slavery when these churches divide. And that's going to lead to civil war, guys. If the churches had never divided, I believe the war would never have happened. But the churches are the ones who made it all come together because they made enemies of each other. And George Washington told us, do not split over political issues. Stay together as the American people, and you shall persevere. They didn't do it here, guys. So by 1850, the country's on a downhill road to slavery, or to a war over slavery. And they're not paying attention here what they have done to themselves in this time period. You know, guys, we don't have good leadership. From Andrew Jackson onward to Lincoln, there's no good leadership here. You have politicians who are trying to run the country, and they're being normal politicians. I want to do things my way, and I don't care about nobody else. They're a bunch of little whiners out here trying to do their own thing, and it does not work out. We need a strong central federal government with a strong president who takes care of the American people. What the president stepped in here in this time period and told the churches, you can't do this. You're going to ruin the country if y'all start doing all this splitting among yourselves. It gets really crazy. So the Methodists and the Presbyterians come back together again, but the Baptists have never rejoined. As a matter of fact, the Southern Baptists have split once again in the 1990s over the moderates and over the conservatives. So you have this split continuing here, guys. Even today, the churches are splitting here over political issues. Okay, and it can happen again. I wouldn't be surprised if this does not happen again in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. The churches start all this craziness again over politics and political policies and all this stuff here. Okay, so guys, the churches split and they start really trying to defend slavery here in the South. That's a major, major talking point here in the South, is the splitting of slavery, or the slavery issue here. Okay, they do not want to see slavery end. That cotton is king, and that's all they care about, are cotton in the cotton fields. Okay, so the South has got a whole new agenda going on here. Now remember this also, it's during this time period that the North is industrializing. They're building textile mills all over the North. They got cotton cloth mills being built, making belts and bridles and saddles. They're making all kinds of clothing. One of the biggest industries was the button industry. You have buttons to button your clothes up. You didn't have zippers in this time. You won't have zippers until the 1920s. So everybody had to use buttons to button their clothes up. And so buttons was a big industry here in this time period. You had people like Samuel Cope and people like Samuel Slater and Eli Whitney. And their main concern was trying to find ways to make exchangeable parts. If a machine breaks down, put new parts on it. Try to fix a machine with new parts here. So you got a whole new mindset evolving here. You got the new inventors here in this time period. You got John Deere and the steel plow being invented. That steel plow is going to plow prairie land. With the steel plow, you can plow up the areas of Nebraska and Iowa and Kansas and Oklahoma. It's possible with the steel plow, and it's going to change everything. You're going to have Cyrus McCormick, who's going to invent the reaper to go through and cut wheat. His reaper is nothing more than a horse-powered lawnmower. That's all it is, a horse-powered lawnmower. When I was a little boy, we had horse-powered lawnmowers that were used to cut the sides of the roads. I remember seeing these mules put on these big, huge lawnmowers on wheels. As the wheels turned, it turned the blade, and therefore they cut the grass by doing so. It had to have a sharp blade, but they cut the grass this way. McCormick started cutting wheat this way. You know, it took one man all day to cut about 1/12 of an acre. That's by hand using a sickle. With McCormick reaper, they can cut like 3 acres in one day. So you see the difference here. Because of the John Deere plow and because of the Cyrus McCormick reaper, you're going to start seeing America turn into a bread basket, the world's bread basket. It's going to improve agricultural production because you can get the wheat out of the fields quicker by doing so. Okay, Elijah Howe is going to invent the sewing machine during this time period. And you're going to have Singer working on sewing machines during this time period. So you're going to start seeing new technology, new materials coming to the forefront here in this time period. And remember another thing too. A lot of these inventors are going to come to America. They're part of the immigration group. We're going to gain more from immigration than from any other source when it comes to technology. Don't y'all remember that? And immigration is very important when it comes to American technology, particularly during this time period. Okay? What if Albert Einstein had not come to America in 1935 and escaped Hitler's Germany? We'd have never had a nuclear weapon to use in World War II. So these people who come to America are very, very important. All those guys who worked on the Manhattan Project were mostly immigrants from Austria, Hungary, and the areas that Hitler took over during World War II. And without them, we'd had a bad time trying to end World War II with Japan. So you see the importance here, guys. Edison and Bell were immigrants. They came in here, and they're the ones whose families came in here, and they're the ones who became our great inventors here during this time period. Okay? It's also in this time period where the factory system begins to explode across the North. You start seeing all these new industries booming here in this time period. You start having new work available for people. I mentioned earlier in the lecture before this one about how we had the putting out system and how they would go and take materials to people's homes to manufacture, and then they decided to build plants to bring the people to the plants, and so they could be watched over as they worked. The new job was called a supervisor. You have the supervisor on the factory system, and you had the overseer on the plantations. Well, another major area of work is going to be middle managers. In this time period, you're going to start seeing the growth of middle managers. This is where men go to school to learn various techniques to run businesses. Ladies, y'all not in this yet. Okay? These men are going to go to law school, become corporate lawyers. A lot of these men go to business school. They become managers over personnel, or managers over raw materials, or managers over the machinery, and so forth. And then you're going to start seeing vice presidents. These vice presidents are department heads who oversee the work beneath them. And then they report to a president who oversees the entire company. He's the main manager of the entire company. Then above the president will be the board of directors. And the board of directors is the ones who oversee all of the corporation and how it operates, and how it produces and how it makes money. They're also troubleshooters. They try to find ways to solve problems here in this time period. Okay, these new middle managers, supervisors, department heads, vice presidents, and so forth, these middle managers are paid a salary. They're not wage earners like the workers are in the workhouse. These people here are salaried people. They make a salary each week. They normally work about 45 hours a week. They work Monday through Friday for about 45 hours a week. Okay? The workers work from sun up to sundown 6 days a week. The only day they have off is Sundays. Okay? So guys, you have these middle managers. These middle managers want to look as if they're wealthy. Yes, these owners of corporations are extremely wealthy. They have big, huge houses. Some of these houses are as big as 10,000 square feet. And these owners of industry are looked up to for their wealth and for what all they have, the material wealth that they have. And these middle managers want to look like the owners of these industries, these owners of these factories. Okay? So they build a house that's like 3,000 square feet. And they don't build it in downtown, they build on the outskirts of town. They'll have special little subdivisions that these people will build together. They're not suburbs yet. We're heading that direction in the 20th century. But they're building these little communities here of middle managers. And of course, they have their little grocery shops, and they have their little shopkeepers and all this stuff around these neighborhoods. Okay? These houses are controlled by the women. We call this the cult of domesticity. The cult of domesticity. This cult here, guys, is trying to make sure that the households are suitable for their working class husbands. So the cult of domesticity is when women take over the house. They take over the home front. Okay? The men work all day. They struggle. They agonize at work. They come home to a refuge, a place of peace and quiet. Unless you got 12 youngins in the house, got 12 kids, ain't gonna be no peace and quiet going on. And a lot of these families did have 8 or 9 or 10 kids. Okay? But guys, when these men came home, the wives were ready for them. They gave them their slippers to put on. They put on their robes. They read the newspapers. They read the magazines of the time period, and so forth. And so the men had a place to come to as a refuge. These working men were called the breadwinners. The breadwinners are these middle class, middle managers of the time period. They're called the breadwinners. And the wife wanted to make sure this house was suitable for him. To make sure these women understood the importance of the house for these working class men, here comes your ladies' magazines. Oh, yes, we had magazines during this time period. And they put sketches and illustrations of how your kitchen should look, and how your living room should look, and how your water closet should look. That's your early bathrooms. And how your bedroom should look, and so forth. And they featured artwork. They featured various kinds of furniture, overstuffed sofas and chairs, beautifully polished mahogany furniture, wood furniture like chiffon and china cabinets and armoires and all this kind of stuff. They went through and showed you a modern kitchen. The modern kitchen had a wood burning stove that had a water tank attached to the back of the stove. The water tank would hold about 40 gallons of water. And each morning, your oldest son would go into the kitchen and he would go to the sink where there's a pump, and he'd pump water out of the water well into the sink and into a bucket, put the water into a bucket, then carry the bucket to the back of the stove and pour it in there. He had to make 40 trips to fill the thing full of water. And then when you went through and lit the stove, you went through and lit that wood in that stove, and they start getting the burner so you go through and cook your eggs and your bacon and so forth, and get your oven warm enough to go through and cook your biscuits. You're producing hot water behind the stove. And that hot water was used for bathing. It was used for cooking and so forth. If you had a little kid who got extremely nasty overnight, and he might have thrown up on himself or whatever, you get your zinc tub out, and you put some cold water in there, and you put some hot water in there, and you throw him in, and you give him a good scrubbing. Most families did not take baths except on Saturday nights. Saturday night was bath night. You want to be clean for church on Sunday morning. So from Monday until Saturday, you don't bathe. As a matter of fact, a lot of doctors told the American people that you could bathe too much. If you bathe too much, you could die from it. This is true in the 1920s when plumbing gets very popular and the hot water heater comes out. The electrical hot water heater comes out. And everybody's taking a bath 2 or 3 times a day. And the doctors started warning Americans that you need some germs on your body in order to survive. If you wash too much, you're going to die. Well, that's true. We'd all been dead a long time ago, because I take about 3 showers a day, especially in summertime. And I know you guys do too, because you go to the creek or you go to the beach and y'all run around playing different kinds of sports and so forth. And you get hot, you get dirty, you go home, take a shower. You might do that at lunchtime and again in the evening when you get home from work. So that's just part of the deal here, guys. So, guys, bathing becomes routine here once a week, maybe twice a week at the most if you really are a dirty person. And that's how they did the bathing this time period. You wash clothes on Mondays. The mother would get all the clothes together, go out in the backyard of the house. She had a big, huge wash pot back here. And under that wash pot, she built a fire. And her sons would go and bring her barrels, or I should say pails of water, to fill that wash pot full of water. They build a fire up on it, get the fire boiling, or get the water boiling, throw in some Brillo tablets, the soap of the time period, throw in some lye soap, and then they threw in the white clothes. You wash the white clothes first, because you don't change your water out in your washing machine. So you wash your white clothes and use a paddle, like an oar, to stir the pot. You got some real bad stains on clothing, you got a washboard. You can scrub off the stain with the washboard. And to the side is another big old zinc tub that you use for bathing in, your 45-gallon zinc tub. It's full of cold water, and you throw your clothes into that cold water. And then the daughters and the sons will stand there and help you wring out those clothes as it comes out of that water. And then you hang the clothes on the line. Once the white clothes are washed, you wash the colored clothes. Doing the same way. And then you same water as you use the white clothes in. And then you throw the clothes into that cold zinc tub of water, and you rinse them out real good, and you hang them on the clothesline. When they get dry, they look like dead cats hanging on the line out there. They're all stiff. So you got to go through and iron them. And you had these little irons that you held in your hands. You had to use pot holders to hold the iron because your iron would sit in front of the fireplace. That's how it got hot. So your iron set in front of the fireplace. You might have 4 or 5 of them because they'd get cold pretty quickly. You get your pot holder, grab an iron, start ironing. When the iron gets a little bit cold, you grab the next one and start ironing some more. If you have 4 or 5 daughters, you can have 4 or 5 ironing boards going. You might have 10 irons on that fireplace out there. And that's how they iron clothes. So washing clothes was a tedious job here, guys. It won't be until the 1920s you'll start seeing the washing machines. It won't be until the 1950s, the late 1950s, when you start seeing clothes dryers. And washer and dryer combos is a 1960s thing. I remember when I first washer and dryer, that's big time here at the house because that meant a lot. No more hanging clothes in the clothesline and no more ironing clothes to make them look nice you could wear them. Otherwise, they'd be all wrinkled. And then you look terrible. Okay? So, guys, these wives are now in charge of the households. They're the ones who design the kitchens they want. They buy the furniture they want. They watch what the neighbor purchases. If the neighbor gets a brand new couch and that man gets home from work, she has a big old dinner ready for him and she feeds him real good. And when he gets comfortable in his chair, reading his newspaper, she'll come and say, I need to talk to you about something. He goes, oh, hell, here it comes. And she'll say, well, Mrs. Smith down the street got a brand new sofa and I like it. And ours is getting kind of raggedy. Well, we just bought this like a year ago. It's not raggedy. We have the dog's got on. It's kind of raggedy. I want a new couch. She's going to hound him for the next 4 or 5 weeks until he finally breaks in and goes, buys that new couch for her and puts the other couch upstairs in one of the spare rooms. Now, she wants a brand new couch in that living room, that other one gone. Okay? That's why you folks see your moms, but every 10 or 12 years, buy brand new furniture for the house. They might keep the bedroom furniture, but the sofas and the chairs in the living room, they don't stay a whole long time. You know, maybe 10 or 12 years, you're replacing all that stuff and trying to repaint the inside of your houses. Okay? So the women are in charge of the house. They're also in charge of the children. The men folks are there to protect the children, to make sure they are stable, make sure they do have food and clothing and a place to stay. But it's the mom who actually raises the children. The father's too busy at work to worry about raising children. And so the mama has 2 major purposes behind her children. Number one, she wants good moral children who are educated. Good moral children who are educated. She wants them educated to the extent that once they leave home, they will not move back home. That once your children are educated and go to college and get through with college, that they're on their own, that they do not come back home. They might get some financial help here and there, but as far as living at home, that does not happen here. They want these kids out on their own, okay? Then, of course, a lot of these kids are going to find mates here in college, and they'll get married and start their own children, start their own families here in this time period. And that's the idea. They want their kids to be extremely democratic. They want their kids to vote. They want their kids to become politically minded and try their best to make sure America is a well-ran democratic country. They want their kids to know the importance of voting here in this time period. Okay? Now, speaking of children, one of the main concerns of women during this time period is birth control. When you have your 14th baby, you're going to start calling time out. You're going to start saying, we had enough of this now. This is getting crazy. All right? Doctors do not handle women's issues during this time period. Pregnancies are handled by midwives, women who go and take care of these women as they have their babies. So doctors are not a part of this scene whatsoever at all. So one of your big questions here is going to be birth control. How do we find a way for suitable birth control here in the 1830s and 1840s? Well, a lot of the midwives tell the women to watch your periods, to make sure that you do not have sex on those days when you could get pregnant, to kind of watch the calendar. Well, you know how that is. That's hit and miss. All right? That could go either way on this. Okay? There's no kind of suitable birth control methods during this time period. You don't have contraceptives. You don't have the pill. So you're kind of on your own here when it comes to birth control. Some wives will cut their husbands off sexually. They'll say no more sex. They'll say no more sex. That you need to go find a different place to find your thrills. I'm through with sex with you. I'll still be married to you. I'll still love you, but I'm not having no more babies for you. So prostitution was a big business during this time period. We had over 300,000 working girls in America during this time period. And they took care of the needs of men, both single and married, who need an outlet. They took care of this. And I'll discuss prostitution more in detail in American History 2 class in the 1890s when it's regulated, and how they go about regulating prostitution across America, and then eventually doing away with it, or trying to do away with it during World War I. Okay, so these girls are here. You got a teenage boy, and you want him to know how to do things correctly, you send him to a prostitute. You find somebody who would teach him, who would train him. And a lot of the men would carry their sons with them if they wanted to go through and visit a brothel. Now, this is kind of few and far between, but it would happen here in this time period. Okay? Women were concerned about their son's sanity and will make sure that they did have the right instructions when it came to sex, and it was not involving self-abuse all the time. That's the main concern here. Okay? Young girls, of course, were talked to by their mothers about how sex operates and so forth, so they're informed about this practice, and try to give them some hints how not to get pregnant all the time. Try to tell them what they had discovered, what they did that helped them from having 14 children. Okay? So it's important. On the same light, we have abortions going on. You know, everybody now is hollering Roe versus Wade and all this kind of stuff. This has been going on since day one, guys. This has been on since the Ice Age. In the 1840s and 1850s, out of 4 children that were born, one was aborted. Out of four pregnancies in America, 1 was aborted. And the midwives did the abortions. And they used all kinds of crude tools. And most of the tools they used were made of iron. If they got too aggressive trying to get that baby out of that uterus and out of that woman's body, they'd go through and tear it up to her body. And using iron, she could get lockjaw or get tetanus and die from it. The churches were totally against birth control. They were totally against abortions. This is that old Victorian sex here. You're a woman, your husband is going to have sex with you. You just lay there and you take it. You should not enjoy it. You should not be screaming or hollering or moving around. That's that old Victorian sex here in this time period. All right. So guys, these abortions were pretty regularly in this time period, because they got tired of having all these babies. And a lot of women died from abortions. And of course, the church says, well, she sinned against God, so therefore she deserved to die. They had no real compassion for a woman who died from abortion during this time period. So Victorian sexuality is very interesting to look at in this slide here also. Also, on the same area of sexuality during this time period, we had a pretty regular, growing, expanding, gay and queer class going on in America. Yes, we had lesbians and we had homosexuals and we had transsexuals and we had transgenders and we had people identified as being queer or being non-sex and so forth. And you start seeing small groups of these people coming together, mainly in your large cities, to form their own little communities. They realized they could not live in mainstream society because homosexuality or any other deviant besides being a regular male-female relationship was considered to be a sin, and is considered to be a major mental problem. If you were gay in this time period, you were considered to have a mental illness, that you were mentally ill. That does not change until the 1970s. In the 1970s, they finally decided that gay and lesbian folks, transgender and so forth, they were not mentally ill. You know, the Native Americans identified people that had these various sexual orientations, and they called them the two-spirited people. They had 2 spirits. They had a male spirit and they had a female spirit. So it's interesting how you look at all this stuff and how those Europeans bring all of this into the picture as it being a sin, as it being different here. Okay, and of course people had major hang-ups over all this stuff. in this time period. Washington, D.C. had a large number of gay men who lived here in the 1850s. One of your presidents is going to be a gay man in the late 1850s. So you're going to start seeing a lot of change take place in this Victorian sexuality time period. By the way, this is the time period where a lot of your states started making laws against various kinds of sex acts or sex in general. And a lot of these laws are still on the books. A lot of your states have repealed a lot of these old Victorian sex laws. But some states, and Florida's one of them, has still got some on the books, and they have not been repealed yet. So they're trying to regulate people's lives and their sexual orientation during this time period. And by the way, like it is today, between 10 and 20% of your people at any given time have homosexual tendencies. So that's just a norm here in this time period. And I identified many gay men who were around during this time period. And my lecture notes, I do discuss gay life in America during this time period. So you can go read those lecture notes and get more detail about what's going on when it comes to sexuality here, guys, in this antebellum or this Renaissance period of time here. Okay? Now, on the same lights, here come the reformers. These women in these middle-class households can't afford to have helpers. And you'll see maids, and you'll see cooks, and you'll see laundresses, and you'll see various people come to the household to help out. They'll hire yard men. They'll go through and help them plant the gardens and keep the yard clean and all this kind of stuff. All right. And by the way, they didn't grow grass in yards during this time period. The yards were swept. It had no grass. Grass was seen as being kind of insulting to be in your yard. So your yard was totally clean and swept. I guess that's why some of these guys are there trying to asphalt over their yards or trying to cement over their yards or putting artificial turf in their yards to get away from all of this. I better do the same thing. I'm tired of yard cutting. I'm tired of yard work. That gets pretty crazy. Okay? So they hire these people to help out, which means the women have leisure time. Once the maid comes in the morning, or the cook comes in the morning and gets a breakfast cooked and gets all the kids fed, the kids will go out and catch the wagon to school. That'll be your school bus during this time period. And sometimes these were covered wagons that look kind of like school buses. They're being pulled by horses. And your kids will go off to school or walk down the street to the neighborhood school. And once the kids are out of the household and you're given all your instructions about how to have the linens changed and all the linens washed and towels washed and all this kind of stuff, you were free for the rest of the day. And you'd go through and you'd join bridge clubs. And a lot of women joined bridge clubs. Read about the women in Savannah, Georgia, who had a big bridge club. When I lived in Savannah back in the 1980s, it was still going on. These upper middle class and these wealthier women in Savannah would go out around 12 o'clock. They would not be allowed in the house until 12 o'clock. And once they entered the house, they found all kinds of finger foods and Long Island iced teas. And they drank and ate all afternoon playing bridge, playing cards. 5 o'clock, most of them couldn't get home. They were too drunk to get home. They had to go through and call a wagon to take them home or a buggy to get them home. Or call the husband to come get them. All right, you had to send a word across town to come get your wife because she's too drunk to get home. I'm sure that caused some interesting situations they got home that evening. All right, women had leisure time. They started joining church groups, particularly the missionary societies. They got heavily involved in the missionary societies. And these women are going to start trying to work on social issues. Social issues are going to be handled by middle-class church-going women. Middle-class church-going women. The wealthy class could care less about the middle class or about social reforms. To them, that is not their concern. Remember, guys, your wealthy class in America are totally segregated from the rest of society. They have self-segregated from the rest of society. They live in their own world, and they have no concerns about the middle class or the lower class. All they're concerned about are their industries and making money. That's their main concerns. Okay? So, guys, these middle class folks in this time period are trying to find a way to reform and redeem society that's going awry. They look at mental illness. When I pull the 1850 federal census, on the very last line of the census, it says, is this person mentally ill? and I saw a lot of check marks. It could be an epilepsy. It could be any kind of mental disorder. Okay. Homosexuality was considered to be mental illness during this time period. That's marked off on these people. So you see a lot of people that have issues here mentally. Well, you look at people who are working here in slavery and sweatshops and men and women working together in these factories, making low wages and living in company towns and have no chance to get out of it. No wonder people wanted to drink and people wanted to go through and use drugs. And the drug use here was extremely heavy in this time period. When it comes to alcohol, the average American drank close to 8 gallons of hard liquor each year. Today it's 2. We were called the Alcoholic Republic during this time period. Okay? Y'all remember that one. Okay? We had opium. We had cocaine. Cocaine was called nose candy. Opium was really popular by a lot of people here. The famous writer, Edgar Allan Poe, was an opium addict. He used opium when he wrote his stories and so forth. And you see marijuana here in this time period. A lot of people are dipping snuff in this time period, including the women folks. And of course, snuff will cause all kinds of mouth cancers. It's like chewing tobacco. It'll eventually cause mouth cancers if you're not careful with these tobacco products. So these folks are diddling and dallying in alcoholism and also in drug addiction. Don't think anything's changed, guys. We still have abortions going on. We still have a drug culture going on. The bars, the taverns are still going on. It's still an 1800 society today when it comes to the social issues of this time period. So trying to find a way to help people mentally was very important. Here comes a lady whose name is Dorothea Dix. Y'all remember Dorothea Dix? Dorothea Dix is the lady who says we got to take the people out of the basements and out of the closets who are mentally ill and put them into an institution to help figure out what is causing their problems. We've got to find a way to help the people who are mentally ill. We need hospitals to observe them, to study them, and find solutions to their problems, okay? That's where the term out of the closet is used for gay guys and gay girls who come after their parents or to their friends. Out of the closet is what Dorothea Dix says we got to do to get people into rehabilitation facilities to help them out. And across the country, we start seeing the construction of mental hospitals in this time period. And Dorothea Dix is a major person behind it. Along the same lines, we said, what causes a criminal? What causes a criminal mind? And so therefore, we start looking at ways to build modern prisons, trying to figure out how to help the people who are criminals. Your first major prison is called Sing Sing on the Hudson River above New York. In New York City, if you go to prison, you're going up the river. You're going to Sing Sing, all right? So they're trying to find ways to help these folks out also, all right? Then here comes the ladies who are trying to promote education. They want to build better school systems, more suitable school systems here in the country. And one of the leaders behind this group was a man by the name of Horace Mann, M-A-N-N. Horace Mann is a reformer who gets in with the middle-class women to build a new school system. They want to have kids ranked by ages, by grades. And school is going to go from the 1st grade to the 8th grade. Once you finish the 8th grade, you're considered to be educated. If you want to go to college, you've got to go to a prep school for several years. That'll be your high schools today. And then you go to college from there. And a lot of your kids, a lot of your middle-class kids will have the ambition to go all the way through college because they realize the better jobs will come if you are college educated, particularly if you're going to be a lawyer or a doctor or a dentist or some professional area that you need to have this education in order to qualify to have these jobs. So this is very important here, guys, okay? You don't start seeing high schools until the early 20th century. That's when you start promoting the high school movement during this time period. And of course, a lot of your communities around the country are going to start building public schools here, guys, in the 1830s and 1840s. You go through and read the history of Mobile, Alabama, you will see in the 1820s where a lot of people from Massachusetts, from Boston, moved to Mobile. They moved down here because of cotton production. A lot of these guys were cotton brokers or cotton agents. A lot of these guys were financial men who invested in cotton futures and all this kind of stuff. And they moved to Mobile. In Boston, slavery never did take on really big. And these folks come down here and they build big houses on Government Street, and they're still there. And the first thing they did was they got household servants. They bought people to work in their households. Yes, they had slaves, but they called them household servants. They bought into the system. In 1832, they decided it's time for Mobile to have a modern school, a school like Boston would have. Downtown in Mobile on Government Street, they're going to get a whole city block. And here they're going to start building what is called Barton Academy. It's spelled B-A-R-T-O-N, Barton Academy. Barton Academy is going to cost $250,000 to build. It's going to cover the entire city block. $250,000. They didn't have the money to build it with. So they decided to have a lottery, to have a school lottery. And they sold $300,000 in lottery tickets. And the winner of the lottery won $50,000. That's like 50 million today, guys. That's a big deal here. They built Barton Academy, a public school system. Now, Mobile is full of Catholic schools because it's an old French town. There's plenty of Catholic schools. Well, a lot of you people decide to send their kids to Barton Academy because they figure to be the best of the best. But a lot of kids didn't make it at Barton Academy. They were not smart enough, or they was not getting their attention, and they were not doing so well at Barton Academy. If your kid did not do well at Barton Academy, you could get a voucher to send him to a Catholic school. And they had school vouchers going on during this time period. So y'all think school lotteries and vouchers are anything new? They're not. They've been around for a long, long, long time. They've been used to build these schools here back in this time period. And of course, remember, you're going to have the section lands they'll be used in the rural areas to build your public schools with. So you're going to start seeing schools being built across the South here using the section land. And people like Mobile and New Orleans and so forth, the larger cities, doing these school lotteries to build the building. By the way, Barton Academy is still there. Barton Academy had been vacated for a number of years. They decided to bring it back. And they are remodeling Barton Academy. It's going to cost them close to $40 million to rebuild this building, to remodel this building. And it's going to be a first-class educational center once it is finished. You go to Mobile, guys, get off Interstate 10 before the George Wallace tunnels and come through the Bankhead Tunnel, the old Highway 90 tunnel, and come into town. And about 10 blocks up, 6 blocks up, on the right-hand side, you'll see Barton Academy. It's got a big, huge wrought iron fence around it. You go to Mobile, make sure you go to the museums. There's some 30 museums in downtown Mobile. Y'all hit those museums, particularly the City of Mobile Museum, where it shows all these old houses that these people from Boston had built, and they're all doll houses. And the funny thing is the interior of the doll houses and all the furniture is exactly what it is in the houses. So you have the same wallpaper, the same furniture that's actually in the house. It's a pretty interesting place to go to here, guys. See all these doll houses here of the houses of Mobile from the antebellum period or from the Renaissance period. Okay, all right. Another major concern was hospitals. Hospitals were people were dying in hospitals. Doctors didn't wash their hands between surgeries. Most people didn't even go to the hospital. They went to the butcher. The butcher was a better surgeon than the actual doctors were. They figured if butchers are butchering animals all day, they'll have no problem doing the human anatomy. If you got gallstones, you went to the butcher. And he'd cut you on the side there, and he'd take those gallstones out and sew you back up. The only problem is he didn't wash his hands or wash his butcher block table from where he went through and killed the animals. So you could catch all kinds of nastiness and all kinds of diseases and skin infections from laying on that butcher block table having surgery done. And of course, there's no way to put you to sleep. They just got you drunk. They got you drunk, and they started cutting on you after you got drunk. All right. So that's not a good way to go either. It won't be until the American Civil War we're going to start learning how to do new surgical procedures and start using new tools for surgery. In the 1870s, when steel comes out, you're going to start seeing stainless steel equipment. Stainless steel improves surgery immensely because you're not using iron tools to do surgery on. And remember, iron will give you lockjaw. That's when you step on a nail barefooted, you had to go get a tetanus shot. All right, make sure you're up on your tetanus shots because of that. Okay, so guys, surgery is going to change because they build the modern hospitals. Pensacola built a modern hospital in 1830. Their hospital had a surgical room that's outside. They put up walls like a fort, but they had no ceiling on it. They wanted to have enough sunlight come in here that they could see what they were doing in the surgery. In a room trying to hold up a lantern, you couldn't see so well. You go outside with your surgeries onto a patio or a dock or a deck area, whatever, it's a lot easier to see what you're doing out here in the sunlight. And the floor of the operating room was covered in white sand. If any kind of blood or a gallbladder or gallstones fell on the ground out there, they just go through and shovel it up, throw it in the trash can, and put more white sand out there to cover up the blood. It kept it sterile. And they figured using the sand from the beach, which had salt in it, kept it sterile. So guys, our researchers were done here in Pensacola in this operating theater that's on the outside of the hospital in this time period. Okay? I read all this up in the newspapers. You guys need to read those newspapers from the 1830s and 1840s. I'm telling you, there's a lot of stuff to see. If y'all go to the University of West Florida, they have every one of the newspapers in the whole Southeast, or at least in our area, on microfilm. And it's a lot easier to find out what's going on when you got microfilm, you go through and read it. It's just that trying to read in a book, somebody went through and kind of edited or kind of slanted it. You can go read the paper and see how it actually was during this time period. And look at the old ads. The old ads for birth control devices and all this kind of stuff, and for all kinds of medicine for rheumatism and hair loss and trying to lose weight. Same old, if you see today on your Facebook pages and on your accounts that you have on the internet, trying to advertise, trying to sell you something. Same thing here going on in the 1830s and 1840s. Snake oil salesmen is what they called them during this time period, and we still have them. Okay? Another interesting area were your orphanages. We had hundreds, thousands of children across America that had no families. Sometimes you had 4 or 5 brothers and sisters who tried to stay together. And that 11-year-old boy or the 11-year-old girl, who's the oldest, became the parent, trying to find ways to help these children, trying to find food for these kids and so forth. New York City and Boston and Philadelphia, your port cities, were filled with children who were vagrant. They were vagrant children. They had no place to go to. They had no family members. A lot of these kids were from Germany, and a lot of these kids were from Ireland. In the 1840s, during the potato famine that took place in Ireland and the wars that broke out in Germany, a lot of people took their children and came to America. They couldn't afford the old steamboats that made a 1-week crossing. They were on the old coffin ships, those 6- and 8-week passages on these old sailing ships. And sometimes the parents died on the way across the Atlantic Ocean, or over half the family would die on the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Smallpox would break out on these ships, and other diseases, including the flu. Okay? When they arrived in America, sometimes these kids had nobody but themselves. They'd go through Castle Garden, a clearing place here on the south side of New York Harbor. It's down here in the Battery region. It's before you have Ellis Island, the big, huge immigration clearing place. Before Ellis Island, you had Castle Garden. These kids would go through and identify themselves, then head on into the city and live in streets and in alleyways and in cellar holes and so forth. It got so bad in the early 1850s. Here comes Charles Loring Brace. Charles Loring Brace. Mr. Brace is going to form what is called the Children's Aid Society. He's going to tell New Yorkers if they will give him 18 cents a day, he can feed the children. We still have this, guys. Y'all watch late night TV and you'll see Feed the Children being advertised on television. Send money and we will go through and make sure these kids have food. I'm not sure if I really trust these folks because they're spending all this money on advertising. I'd rather go through and feed the children by giving a child $1 or $2 than going through against an organization that's going to spend on paying salaries for people and paying advertising. That's why I give money. I try to give it to individuals, to families that might need it, and I do that from time to time. Go to a place and there's a family that you can tell they don't have a whole lot and they're not doing really well, and just say, here's your $25, here's $25, here's $30. Just go inside, get what you want. Don't worry about it. You know, that's the best way to handle this situation. It's just to do it on the individual level. You're not out there broadcasting that you're giving all this money away, these different groups. I don't give to political campaigns. I don't give the Red Cross or any of these guys because they pay too much salaries out, and the money does not go where it needs to go. I see Panama City 2 years after the hurricane and how messed up it still is, and the Red Cross did not step in and do what they should have done. I said, no way. It's like the American Red Cross. They don't, I mean, the American Cancer Society. You find out that their manager makes over $2 million a year. It's like, you know, this is ridiculous. You know, I'm not going to give because y'all turn this into a big business. That's all it boils down to. Well, Mr. Brace is asking for 18 cents a day from New Yorkers, and he starts getting donations. People actually send him money to help feed these children. And in the evening, he brings these kids into his Episcopal church. He's a minister. He's an Episcopal minister. He brings the kids into his church. He has women and men in the church who help him with the children. The children will get baths and get clean clothes to wear, and they'll also will have good food to eat. He says the very minimum I can afford to buy I can afford to have beanies and weenies at the least. They try to have better food for the kids here. You know what concerns me about all this stuff is who watched over these people who are doing these duties with children, and how many pedophiles were getting jobs in a Christian organization, in a Christian way. Well, that brings me to the Catholic Church in this time period. The Catholic Church had orphanages all over the country. When I pull the 1850 federal census and go to Cincinnati, Ohio, and go to Chicago, or go to Detroit, or go to Nashville, Tennessee, or whatever, I see all these orphanages. And you know, they're an orphanage because the kids all have different names, and there'll be 2 ladies who are identified, or 3 or 4 ladies identified as being the nuns, and there'll be 2 or 3 priests at the end of the list. And I start wondering, if you have 25 or 30 children in these orphanages, and you have these 3 or 4 nuns over to the children, what are the priests up to? What are they doing? If they're guilty of abusing children in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, and even today, you know they were guilty then. So it makes you wonder who's taking care of these children during this time period. Well, Charles Loring Brace hatches up an idea in 1855. He says, across the country, we have hundreds and thousands of families that need little kids in the households. Little kids can do menial labor. These older adults can get a child in the household who can take care of them in their old age. Send a kid who's 10 or 12 years old to a family that's in their 60s. And let them become part of the family to find a place to send these kids. And so he realizes here by 1855, the railroads are going all over the place out of New York. They're going as far west as Indianapolis, Indiana. All right, they're going as far, some of them are going as far west as St. Louis, Missouri during this time period. And so Mr. Brace decides to put these children on the trains to carry them to new locations. And they're called the orphan trains. My lecture notes have complete details of what's going on here with these folks. Okay? On a Wednesday evening, he'd have a passenger car reserved for his kids. Now, these cars could normally carry about 50 or 60 people at a time. With little kids, you could put 80 of them on there. You got plenty of room for 80 kids. He'd send 3 chaperones with the kids. One for the front door, one for the back door, and one to kind of take care of the kids in the middle. Okay? They wouldn't run out on them. These trains would leave usually about sunset and take off. And they'd make their way across the country, heading up toward Buffalo, heading out toward Columbus or Toledo or Cleveland or Indianapolis or wherever. These kids would arrive at their destinations usually on a Friday afternoon. And here, Brace had reserved hotel rooms, and the kids were housed for the evening. Let's say we're going to St. Louis. On Friday morning, the St. Louis Dispatch, the newspaper, will be an article that says that children are coming from the East to be adopted by Midwesterners. These kids have no families, and we're trying to find suitable homes for these kids to go to. Go to the Opera House on 3rd Avenue, Saturday morning, in the date, October the 20th, whatever the date might be, and be there by 8 o'clock. First come, first serve. You had families all over St. Louis come to the Opera House to adopt these children. And sometimes you'd have families together. You'd have the older daughter who's like 11 years old, and then a son who's 10, and then another little girl who's 8, another little boy who's 7, another little boy who's 6, another little girl who's 5, maybe a little baby about 2 years old, a toddler. And sometimes these kids got divided. They split up these families, and these kids did not know where the other ones were. You know, in today's world, through DNA testing, we are finding these families again. I had a lady here in Val Peace, 79 years old, who's told me for the last 60 years, I've been trying to find my family. I know I got a gut feeling there's more than just me. My mother had me out of wedlock, and I was given to an aunt to raise, and they never told me who my family was. And she tried over and over again through doing genealogy research, trying to find her family, and nothing worked. One afternoon, I said, you need to go through and try doing a DNA test. You go to 23andMe or to Ancestry, and you do a DNA test. And she did. You do a DNA test, they don't identify you, but they send word out across the country that you are a relative of this person and so forth. One of those aunts called her. One of her cousins called her and says, I know who your brother is. I know where he's located. She found her family. This is about 5 years ago. Okay? But these get separated. These kids go to homes that do not have background checks. You know, you go to adopt a puppy, they're going to come to your house and make sure your house is suitable for that puppy. And they're going to make sure your backyard is big enough and it's fenced in, and the dogs can do quite well for themselves in your household. They didn't do it for these kids. Those folks walked in there, signed a registry. They went through and pulled the kid, and they put the kid's name down for the person's name, and that was the end of it. They carried those kids home. Over 250,000 children will take the offering trains across the country from 1855 until 1929, when it finally ended. During the Great Depression, President Franklin sent out people, I should say President Roosevelt sent out people to go and do local histories, and they found these kids. And these kids told their stories. One little boy said, they beat me. I do all the menial labor. I'm not fed very much food. I'm always hungry. I am lonesome that nobody will hug me or touch me or give me any kind of instruction, any kind of positive instruction. I am knocked about. I'm treated horrible. And my bedroom's under the staircase. One little boy says, they're so good to me. I am 12 years old. My mom and my daddy are in their 60s, and they love me. They hug me all the time. They take care of me. They give me lots of good food. I have my own bedroom. I got a pony, a puppy, and a cat. And you got a pony. I got a pony for my little cart that I drive around. And life is good for him. Life is good for him. And these kids, you will see this. Most of them went to pretty good homes. Very few went to abusive homes, and some went to indifferent homes. The vast majority went to good homes here in this time period. And these kids were spread across the country in this time period. By the way, there was a young kid that got on the offering trains in the late 1860s, early 1870s, and made his way to Arizona on the offering train, became a notorious outlaw because he belonged to a gang in New York. His name was Billy the Kid. So y'all think about that kind of stuff. All right. So guys, we're trying to find a way to help society out as much as possible with the orphanages, with hospitals, with mental illness, with a new school system, with morality in this time period, trying to deal with birth control and abortions during this time period, trying to build suitable middle-class homes so the kids become very democratic citizens in the future. This is part of that reform movement during the time period, okay? Now, in your lecture notes, you'll also find where I discuss the cities and the sewage and all that kind of stuff. I put that over in the lecture number, it's number 8 with Andrew Jackson because it fit better in there. So I've done a little bit of editing as I've been doing these lecture series on Zoom. So y'all can find all this stuff and you can keep up with it. So if you're on your term sheet, you find the cities on there and so forth. We've already discussed it. It's in another area. Y'all just look for that. You'll be able to find it with no problem. Okay? And then here comes the American writers. These are called the American Renaissance writers. Not antebellum, but Renaissance writers. These people include Mr. Washington Irving. Yeah, y'all know him. Mr. Irving was a New York writer. He wrote one of the early histories of New York. And he wrote a book called the Sketchbook. And in the sketchbook was a headless horseman and Mr. Rip Van Winkle. Mr. Rip Van Winkle and the Headless Horseman was in his sketchbook. He wrote this book in 1819, okay? Right behind him in 1826 comes another major book. It is called The Last of the Mohicans. The Last of the Mohicans. This book was written by James Fenimore Cooper. James Fenimore Cooper. And y'all should have at least seen the movie or read the book here, The Last Mohicans here, from 1826. The next important writer of this time period is going to be Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's part of the Transcendentalists during this time period, trying to figure things outside the box for a change. Mr. Emerson told the American people that you need to write, that you need to keep a diary. By keeping a diary, you can write down your life events as if it's a story. And he says you need to write down what you know, to write down what you know, okay? So Mr. Emerson tells the American people, write diaries. And I want to tell you something. A lot of stuff I tell you guys in these classes, a lot of these lectures involve diary entries. I have read a lot of diaries from this time period. If you want to get excited, you guys want to get excited, y'all read the diary of Davy Crockett. There's some good stuff in there. Or go read the diary of Mary Chestnut from the Civil War time period. These diaries give you a lot of insight that you would not have otherwise in your American history. And of course, it is a big story. That's why I can tell it to you it's a story because it makes it more sense by doing so. Okay? And Mr. Emerson says to write what you know. I want you guys to consider doing something in your college career. Sometime in your college or undergraduate career, you need to take a creative writing class. Dr. Vicki Hunt teaches one out here, and she's really good at it. Okay? The first thing they're going to tell you in a creative writing class is to write what you know. I took one at Florida State. When I was left the limited and was getting ready to go to Ole Miss to graduate school, I took 2 semesters at Florida State just to get kind of boned up and get back to the old routine of being academically minded. And I took a creative writing class. And the professor I had written a book. And he was really, really good at it. He's passed away now, but he was really a good teacher that taught creative writing. And I learned a lot. It helped improve my writing for research papers. It gives you another perspective to look at while you're doing your writing. And writing creatively and writing for research is two totally different animals. You need to know the difference between how to write academically and how to write for creative purposes. It's a totally different way of writing here. You got to use different sides of your brain to do this kind of stuff. Okay? But remember Ralph Emerson, and a lot of people wrote diaries during this time period. Then there's Henry Thoreau, another transcendentalist, a poet. He wrote a book called Walden in 1854. You know, these transcendentalists were also involved in health, trying to get really healthy and stay healthy, both mentally healthy and sexually healthy. And one of these big people this time period was a man by the name of Kellogg. And he invented a cereal to keep men happy, to help you improve not only your mental life, but also your sexual life. And cornflakes is going to be the cure to all your problems. So you guys better start eating some boxes of cornflakes here and keep up with it. That's what he was up to. You had Mr. Graham do the same thing. He invents what is called the Graham cracker. And the Graham cracker is considered to be a food that helps you with your mental state. So you guys need to eat some Graham crackers and some cornflakes from time to time. Okay? But Mr. Walden is a well-known poet here in this time period. Then you have Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote one of America's first major novels, and it is called The Scarlet Letter. The book came out in 1855. I have gone to school at Niceville High School. I've gone to school at Ocklawaha Community College. I've gone to school at Troy University. I've gone to school at Florida State, and I've gone to school at Ole Miss, and then the University of West Florida. And about every school I went to, and I took a lit class, I had to read this crazy book. I am so tired of the Scarlet Letter. I don't even want to look at it again. I ain't gonna never read it again because I'm just so tired of the Scarlet Letter. It's a great novel. Y'all need to read it. But once you go through and you read it several dozen times and are tested on and all this kind of stuff, you get kind of tired of it. Okay, so Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, 1850. Then here comes the poet Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is going to write a collection of poems called The Leaves of Grass. The Leaves of Grass is going to be published in 1855, and it will be heavily edited from then on. He just could not be satisfied with this book. He's always working on this book. Kind of reminds me of Mr. Hemingway. Mr. Hemingway told the American writers, this Ernest Hemingway, told the American writers, he says, I'd rather write a novel than write a short story. A novel is over with in about 6 weeks. A novel takes 6 years. A novel is done in 6 weeks. A short story takes 6 years to get it done. There's a lot of truth in that. If you guys do any creative writing, you will find that out pretty quickly. You'll spend more time on a short story than you do on a novel. Okay? And then, of course, you have Mr. Herman Melville. Mr. Melville wrote a book called Moby Dick and a book called Billy Budd. And y'all should have read both of these books by now. They should have been on your reading list in high school and in middle school. Billy Budd should have been taught around the 10th grade. And Herman Melville is a gay writer, and his writing is very interesting to read here. And his characters do have homosexual influences in the narratives. So it's interesting to read the works of Mr. Melville and read Moby Dick. It's published in 1851. And then, of course, our Southern writer, the big one, is Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. He lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and he wrote The Raven and Other Poems in 1845. I consider Mr. Poe to be our Stephen King of this time period. And of course, Mr. Poe had some interesting encounters with drug addiction, with alcoholism. And I think a lot of his craziness and his writing came from this other side of his mental state while he was high on these drugs. And he did write some interesting poems and stories here in this time period. Then here comes Emily Dickinson. She's one of the most well-known American female poets of the time period, and she uses an off-verse rhyme in her poetry. And of course, she's extremely popular. When y'all take your English 2 lit class here at the college, you'll probably be reading some Emily Dickinson, and you'll be probably reading some Edgar Allan Poe. It's a little bit of Herman Melville, and maybe a little bit of Thoreau in these classes. And I think you should enjoy these classes. I think if you read these classes, you would enjoy them. Y'all realize something here, guys, real quickly. If I didn't teach history, I'd be teaching lit classes, and I love lit. I love reading all these different writers. I love writing myself and trying to produce some novels and some historical books and so forth. To me, it's relaxing, it's therapeutic to do this sort of thing. Okay? And then, of course, here comes Frederick Douglass. Do not forget about Frederick Douglass. As a 16-year-old boy, he left the plantation in Maryland. He was enslaved. He ran away from the plantation and made it all the way to New York City. When he arrived, he told the people, I arrived with no loss of bone or blood. I arrived in safety to New York City. And this young teenager is going to go to school. He realizes that the most important part of freedom is going to be education. In 1845, he writes a book. He's the first slave in American history that wrote a book about slavery. It is called The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass. The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass. A lot of folks believe in this time period that slave people, African Americans, do not have a soul. So therefore, you do anything you want to with them. And Mr. Douglass is going to point out that we're all human. We're all the same. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln had decided not to have African American soldiers in the United States Army. The generals had deemed that these men would not fight. They would run off the battlefields. They would not fight. They'd be cowards. Frederick Douglass came to see Lincoln. And Douglass told him what's what. He told him, I'm a man just like you are. I've got a soul just like you have. I'm going to go to heaven just like you're going to heaven. And don't judge us by our skin tones. That we are Americans. And you will see if you put our people into the United States Army and have these young men fighting for the freedom of their families and the freedom of all of their race, you'll see a different kind of soldier. In 1862 at Antietam, the first African-American soldiers will be employed in this battle. And the generals will write, we have never seen men with such courage, that these men are true freedom fighters. In 1898 in Cuba, they're known as freedom fighters. In World War I, working with the French in World War I, the African-American troops in the United States were called the Hell Fighters. In World War II, they're known as the Tuskegee Airmen. They fought valiantly in Vietnam and in the Persian Gulf and in the war of terrorism. And these people have proved themselves to be true freedom fighters. But what do they get in return? What do they get in return? It's time for America to come together as one group and stop all this craziness of trying to be segregated and trying to look down upon people and trying to harass and molest people just because they feel like they have the power to do so. It's got to come to an end, guys. Right? And Frederick Douglass is one of your first major civil rights leaders in America. Without Frederick Douglass, you would not have Dr. King. You've got to have Douglass first. And he's very important here in this time. Okay? And then finally, the last major writer is going to be Harriet Beecher Stowe. The Beecher family is well known for being ministers. They're an old Massachusetts group. They've been writing up here and preaching up here for generations. And Harriet Beecher Stowe decides to write a book about slavery. The book is called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The year is 1851. In 1850, the United States Congress passed what is called the Fugitive Slave Act. It said that any runaway slave from the South could be tracked across the North by federal troops, arrested, and brought back to slavery. This horrible, horrible Fugitive Slave Act is going to say if you run away from slavery in the South, you better go to Canada. You could get recaptured. Under Franklin Pierce administration as president, over 300 people were captured and brought back to slavery by the United States military. And her book deals with runaway slaves in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this horrible, horrible Fugitive Slave Act. This book will sell over 2 million copies. It'll be translated into over 30 different languages. Okay, and this book becomes a major, major player in the northern people changing their minds about slavery. You see, guys, when Mr. William Lloyd Garrison started his Liberator magazines and his anti-slavery people started invading the South with all this anti-slavery literature, a lot of Northerners said they're not minding their business, to leave the South alone, that they're doing what they should be doing down here. And people were pretty much siding with slavery. Do y'all know that your Jacksonian presidents all sided with slavery? Either they were Northerners or Southerners. They sided with slavery. Franklin Pierce sided with slavery. Buchanan sided with slavery. Fillmore sided with slavery in this time period. And these were all Northern presidents. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe is saying that America is wrong. We've got to go through and change this system. And with this book, these abolitionists will have more power, and the Northern people will start hating slavery to a greater extent. So the war is going to have a real major influence from this book by Harriet Beecher Stowe. You know, Lincoln met her during the war. Lincoln was about 6'4". She's about 5 foot even. And she's a little short lady, and she walked up to him and they shook hands, and he looked down on her top of her head. They couldn't see her eye to eye, that's on his knees. And he says, so you're the little lady who caused this big bad war. That you're the little lady who caused this big bad war. A truth in that. Harriet Beecher Stowe is going to change the mind of Northern people, and they turn their attention away from slavery to ending slavery. It's important that you guys realize this. Okay? So those are your American Renaissance writers that I have identified that I think are important for you guys to look at. I do have bios on all of these guys in your lecture notes. You want to read about each of these people individually, you can. And I think you'll enjoy reading about these folks. So don't forget about Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, Ralph Waldo, can't even talk today, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Those are your American Renaissance writers of this time period. All right? You also have some artists during this time period. Now, I will tell you photography is up and coming. You know, the Egyptians had photography because it took like 24 hours to develop their pictures using the sun and so forth. But in the 1820s, the French perfected a new way of making pictures by using glass negatives. And so you're going to start seeing more and more photographs being used here during this time period. All right. One of the most famous photographers was Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady owned a photography studio in downtown New York City. And the first president that he made a photograph of is going to be John Quincy Adams. Now, Adams had done left the presidency by this time, but he had been a president. So your first president of the photograph is going to be John Quincy Adams. Every year after the inauguration, or sometimes after the inauguration, Matthew Brady would go down to Washington, D.C. and make a new photograph of the president. And on April the 14th, 1865, he goes down to Washington, D.C. to make a new portrait of the president, President Lincoln. He made the picture and took the glass negative out, and while trying to develop it, it broke. He made it one print and he threw it all away. Kept the print, threw the rest away. Well, guys, that evening, Lincoln was shot and killed. A lot of people say that negative breaking was foretelling the death of Lincoln here by Matthew Brady. But Matthew Brady was a major photographer in this time period. His office was down there where P.T. Barnum had his museum, the American Museum. If you guys have watched The Greatest Showman, you know all about the American Museum that P.T. Barnum built here in downtown New York City. And Mr. Brady was down there. There's on Printing Press Road. And people would always come down here to go to the museum and get a picture taken. It's just part of the day's activities here in this time period. But you also had your artists, the ones who actually went out with ink and pen and paint and actually painted and illustrated the landscape. The first one is going to be Thomas Cole, C-O-L-E. Thomas Cole is from England. He comes to America, and he starts painting what is called the Catskill Mountains. He paints the mountains of northern New York, Vermont, and New Hampshire. You have Thomas Cole. Then you have George Catlin. George Catlin in the 1830s is going to go out west, and he's going to live among the Indian folks. He joins right in there with them. They loved old George Catlin. They got a kick out of him, his drawings. They stand there behind him and watch him draw their teepees and the buffalo herds and the buffalo hunts and all the things that he painted out here on the Great Plains. George Catlin was known for his paintings of the American frontier, the American West, the Native Americans. That's what he's known for. In the 1850s, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is going to destroy the Native American way of life, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to put the railroads across the country. Going to start surveying for the railroads going across the country. And when they did this, George Catlin realized they're going to ruin the Indian way of life. And so George Catlin is going to go to Washington, D.C. And George Catlin becomes a major spokesperson for Indian affairs during this time period. So George Catlin is a very important person when it comes to Indian affairs and painting the life of the Indians. I got a big book here at the house that has the paintings of George Catlin in it. They're very beautiful paintings. Y'all go to Google, type in George Catlin artwork, go to images, and y'all look at his artwork. There's some beautiful stuff that he painted out here in this time period. And then there's James Audubon. He's going to tour America painting the wildlife. And he comes to our area. He spends quite a bit of time in Northwest Florida. Down here, he's going to paint our various birds. He paints the alligators. He paints the Florida panthers, the cougars. He paints the black bears, and all the snakes, all the items, all the different animals we have and reptiles we have in Florida. He's going to paint them. Then he moves over to Louisiana above Baton Rouge, and he does more paintings. He goes on to Texas and does more paintings. But John James Audubon is known for his birds, for painting the birds. And that's why today you have the Audubon Society. The Audubon Society are your bird watchers, the ones who protect the birds. And John James Audubon is the man who painted them back here in the antebellum Renaissance time period. All right. And then you have George Caleb Bingham. George Caleb Bingham is going to start painting America at work, particularly on the rivers. He loves the riverboats. He loves the flatboats and the gill boats. He loves the dock hands. And he's going to paint the docks at New Orleans and at Natchez and at Memphis and Greenville, Mississippi. He's going to paint the docks up here in Cape Girardeau. He's going to paint the docks in St. Louis and Kansas City. He goes up the Missouri River. He goes to Minneapolis, St. Paul. He goes up the Ohio River, painting people at work. And here again, you can go to Google, type in John James Audubon, type in George Caleb Bingham, type in Thomas Cole or George Catlin, and look at their images. Look at their artwork that they did in this time period. It's some really impressive items here that they have done in this time period. Okay? So here comes the major artwork. Here comes the early days of photography. Okay? In 1828, here comes the first steam-powered press. The steam-powered press is the next step on the road to the World Wide Web. It all begins down here in the Fertile Crescent. They took clay tablets and started keeping inventories on clay tablets. It goes to hieroglyphics. It goes to the Greek and to the Roman languages. It's going to go to the German languages, the French languages, and the Italian languages, and so forth. All right? In 1440s, or 1460s, I should say, here comes Johann Gutenberg with a new printing press that's a copy or an improvement upon the Chinese press that came out around 900 AD. So you go from the clay tablets to writing on scrolls and reeds and so forth, reed paper, up to the Chinese printing press. It goes to the Gutenberg press, and now the press goes steam-powered. The steam-powered press. The steam-powered press made newspapers extremely cheap. It made newspapers extremely cheap. One of your big publishers here in this time period was Mr. Thomas. I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett was the editor of the New York papers, and he's going to write. He's going to tell people that, and the newspapers do not tell you the news. It should tell you what you want to know, not what's actually out there. So the fake news business is going to come with Mr. Bennett, James Gordon Bennett, who came in from Scotland and started the New York Tribune a newspaper. And he started writing about rapes and murders and suicides and all kinds of vice that nobody else was writing about, because he says that is what you want to read. Well, he still did shipping records and stock market reports and all this kind of stuff, but his main thing was the vice, the dark side of life is what he wrote about, because it sold newspapers. And the more outrageous the newspaper story was, the better it was, the better the paper sold. You know, they started selling short stories in the newspapers. They told the local writers, y'all write me some stories up and I'll go through and print each chapter in the paper each week. And that, therefore, if you want to keep up with the story, you've got to buy the paper each week. All right? These are the story. One of your greatest writers wrote all of his novels this way, and he used the London newspapers to do it. Who was he? Who's a great British author that used the newspapers to publish his books entitled Great Expectations, David Copperfield, Nicholas Nickleby, The Tale of Two Cities? Who was he? And have y'all read these books? And y'all should say yes to that, because his name is Charles Dickens. And I made sure the Valparaiso Library has every one of Charles Dickens' books. But more importantly, I bought every movie that I could get from BBC. The BBC, the British Broadcasting, they do their books in the entirety. They don't go through and edit books on their films. They show you the whole book. I bought their collection. I gave it to the library at Valp to have some people to watch all this stuff. The Tale of Two Cities is a book about this thick. I watched the movie. It took 15 hours to watch the movie on Tale of Two Cities. Okay, it took me 3 days to watch that movie, okay, because they cover the entire book. And so if you want to go through and really look at Charles Dickens, read the book, and then go get the BBC movies. And Amazon does have them. You can order from them too, individually. So you can get those books. You can take a lit class. I advise you doing it. It'll help you understand it a whole lot better, okay? But these newspapers are going to start publishing all kinds of articles here. If you want to read them or not, here they are. They're all here. What you want to know is what their slogan was. All right. You also are going to see a major publishing of Bibles during this time period. The steam-powered press increases the number of Bibles being published during this time period. You're also going to see lots of church sermons being published. You can subscribe to a minister's sermons through the mail. And they'll mail the sermon to you. If he preaches a sermon on Sunday, it gets published on Monday mornings. And Tuesday afternoons, it gets mailed out. And usually within a week or two, you'll have the sermon at your house, depending on how far away you live from where that preacher is preaching. And you'll have that sermon to read to your family around the dinner table after supper, okay? All right? Then you're going to start seeing happening here, people trying to find a way to send communications through various means, okay? And one of these people is going to be a British inventor whose name is William Sturgeon. William Sturgeon in 1825 is going to lay down the foundations for communications through a wire by using what is called the electromagnet. The electromagnet will be used to help send communication electronically through a wire system, okay? In 1830, an American named Joseph Henry is going to demonstrate that electromagnets can be used for long-distance communications by sending current through a wire that could be coded and then deciphered into words or translated into words here. His first electronic experiment that he did took the current over 1 mile. That's pretty good here, guys, in 1830 and 1830s. Okay. Over at New York University is a professor of arts and design whose name is Samuel Morse. In 1835, Samuel Morse is going to invent what is called the Morse code. And here comes the telegraph system. The Morse code is going to transmit signals through a copper wire. Okay? So the Morse code is invented by Samuel Morse in this time period. Okay? And this has all been perfected by 1838. By 1838, he's going to send word across this from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. It's a 40-mile distance, okay? And his message is going to be funded by Congress at $30,000. $30,000 will be used from Congress to help promote his new wireless system here. All right. 6 years later, Congress witnesses sending and receiving messages over parts of the telegraph line. Okay? And the first time it's used for political purposes will be in 1844. In 1844, on May the 1st, 1844, the Whig Party will use the telegraph machine to announce their selection of Henry Clay to run for the presidency. Okay? Now, the telegraph is going to become very important to the railroad companies during this time period. The railroads realize that they cannot afford to build 2 lanes of track across the country. But they can go off every 20 miles and put a sideline or a dummy line off the main line where trains can pull off onto and wait for a train to come through to pass by. You guys go up to Mossy Head and go down Highway 90, you'll see about 4 miles of cutoffs up here that is used regularly on our trains coming across Northwest Florida. There's one out there between Milton and Pace. There's one out there in Pensacola. And so these trains will pull off on the sideline and wait for the other train to come in, to come by. And the telegraph machine is going to be used to do this with. And it stopped head-on collisions among your trains by doing so. And so you have this new system, guys, in which you will have the telegraph operator sending messages to the train stations, who will tell the train engineer to pull off on that side track 10 miles up the way, up the railroad track, and sit there for about 20 minutes while the other train comes by. And once the train comes by, then proceed with caution as you enter the track and go on from there. So you have this big, huge communications among your railroad people and making sure the trains are safe during this time period. Okay? Another important thing I want you guys to realize is also the telegraph machine is going to go to the newspaper business. It's going to go to the communications business, in which people will send word to family members. The first war we use a telegraph machine in is going to be the war with Mexico. President Polk, sitting in the White House, can send telegraph messages to New Orleans, which can then be relayed down through Texas, down to the American forces on the border of the Rio Grande. And for the first time, your president is commander-in-chief of the Army because of the telegraph machines. All right? Telegraph's going to change everything, guys. To send a letter from Boston to New Orleans will take 6 weeks. A telegraph will take 6 minutes. If your old uncle in Boston dies and you live in New Orleans or Mobile, you can get word in six minutes that he's passed away. You won't be a month or 2 waiting on the word of what's going on in Boston. And then you go through and send word back to Boston, order your flowers from the florist and the whole 9 yards. Even though you're not there, that vase of flowers is your representative that got there through the telegraph machines. It's going to change American society. So, guys, the World Wide Web goes from early writing techniques, the early writing techniques of the Fertile Crescent. It goes up to the Roman and Greek empires. It goes to China, where the printing press is first invented. It goes to the Gutenberg press. Then it goes to the steam-powered press of the 1820s, to the telegraph machine of the late 1830s, early 1840s. Then it's going to go to the telegraph. Then it's going to go to the telephone with Mr. Bell in the late 1870s. All right, and here comes the telephone. During the same time period, you got Mr. Edison working at Menlo Park, and he invents what is called the movie camera. And by 1895, we have motion pictures in America. They're called actualities. They're also called Nickelodeons. Nickelodeons were the little theaters. They show these little 5-minute or 10-minute film strips. Okay? It's going to go from there to the radio. Bellini in Italy starts working on the radio as early as 1900. The radio is perfected during World War I. It comes to America in the early 1920s. By 1926, America is hooked up coast to coast with a radio. And to entertain the American people, you're going to have NBC and CBS radio network, and you'll have the Grand Ole Opry out of Nashville, Tennessee. In the 1930s, we're going to evolve into what is called the television. It will not be available during the Great Depression. It will not be developed. It will not be available during World War II. But in 1947, here it comes. By 1954, over half the American people got a television set, including me, who's 3 years old. Got my first television when I was 3 years old in 1954. I remember that day just as vividly as it was yesterday. It was a big day in our house when we got that television set in 1954. Okay? And then, of course, from there, we're going to have the internet system through the space program. You're going to start seeing satellites in space. By 1975, we have what is called cable networks. We have HBO. We have ESPN. By 1981, we have Turner. We got the Learning Channel. We got MTV. And it's all history from there. It's all history. The World Wide Web in the 1990s, and here comes the computer system. All right? Here comes your smartphones. So the evolution has taken place. You know, I have gone, guys, in my lifetime to a telephone that you had to dial an operator to get the number to call a person long distance. And it'd take 10 minutes to get them on the telephone line, to the cell phone that takes like 2 seconds to get to Paris. It's amazing. It is totally amazing, the technology just in my lifetime. I think about my grandpa's lifetime. He went from the horse and buggy to the airplane to the space shuttle. Okay? So it's interesting here in this time period. All right? So guys, American technology is going to play a major role in this antebellum, this Renaissance period of time. Okay? So y'all remember all this good stuff and what took place here and the importance of the middle-class women in the reform movement during this time period. A lot of these women were Whigs. They're part of the Whig Party in this time period. And they're trying to find a way to clean up America. Okay? All right, that's it for this lecture.